Democracy is not a spectator sport. I often get grabbed and someone will say, KT, you're trying to destroy the parties. I say, heck no, I'm trying to save them. That you've got your customers leaving in droves, and you're building on higher fences around smaller and smaller cities. You are on the road to oblivion, and you might take our country with it.
One word that sums up Kent Thiry, at least for me, and that's leader. You lead in a way that doesn't disconnect you from the people. It actually brings you closer to the people. It actually empowers people.
We have to listen to people's hopes and fears. Democracy didn't come easily. It wasn't sustained easily. It was never intended, it was never marketed to be easy. American people are not nearly as polarized as American legislatures.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you taking an hour out of your day during this hot July that we're all having. Our guest today, I'm really excited to talk with Kent Thiry. I have been an admirer of Kent Thiry since April 13th, 2013. And you might say, wow, that's a pretty specific date. That's actually the day, you might not remember this, Kent, you published an editorial in the Denver Post about the need for open primaries in Colorado. And unlike most people that write editorials, you actually spent the next 3 years making it a reality. You built a very diverse coalition of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. You raised the money. You hired a terrific team of really, excellent professionals. You listened to the voters. You looked at all the legal angles and the policy angles. You did all the work. And lo and behold, in 2016, Coloradans passed 2 referendums for open primaries. You then went on to play a pivotal role in bringing nonpartisan redistricting to Colorado. And I've been, I think many people on this call know you. For those who don't, there's, I think, one word that sums up Kent Thiry, at least for me, and that's leader. Whether in your role as a CEO of a very successful Fortune 500 company, a civic entrepreneur, a philanthropist, a public speaker, a business leader, you're a leader, and you lead in this way that and I hope you don't think I'm kissing your ass too much here. You lead in a way that doesn't disconnect you from the people. It actually brings you closer to the people. It actually empowers people. And I find that inspirational, and I really appreciate you taking time to talk with the open primaries community about what you've done, what you've accomplished, and what you're thinking about heading forward. So thanks, Kent. Great for you to be here.
John, I'm an admirer of yours, but you clearly have no judgment given all those nice things you said. And now I'm almost certainly going to disappoint everyone. So have at it.
Right. I set the bar very high. Now all you can do is fail. Right. Well, you've, as I mentioned, you've worn many hats, and you've put together, you've been both a very successful, innovative CEO at DaVita, one of the most successful healthcare companies in the country, and a very successful civic entrepreneur and political reformer. What are those two things? How do they go together for you? What has that journey been like for you to kind of be doing both of those things over the last many years?
Well, I've had a life filled with good fortune, and if I understand the question correctly, I think a lot of people underestimate how transferable their skills are from whatever their job was to working in the democracy movement. And I think a lot of the disciplines and capabilities and muscles I built as a Fortune 500 CEO for 28 years are really powerfully applicable to the democracy movement and specific initiatives within it. And similarly, all sorts of other experiences that people on this call have, applying your talents and energy can make such a difference. In fact, of course, we all know that's the only way the country got created in the first place.
Got it. So you've been, in the democracy reform space, you played a leadership role in the effort in California. for open primaries. As I mentioned before, you are the mastermind behind the movement in Colorado to open the primaries, both for state and federal, and also presidential primaries, redistricting reform. What have you learned during these efforts? What surprised you? What was hard? What was gratifying? What was your biggest takeaway from all these different efforts?
I'd say two things. One is a lot of people understandably have skepticism about whether or not they can make a difference in this realm. And so what we need to do, those of us who are working in it, is continue to work on our narrative and our examples and our enlistment of people. The second thing is that strategy really matters. And I'll give an example of my first. I've now done 9 initiatives across 3 states, and we've won all 9. And those of you who are experienced in this area know that that's a lot of luck. Just like an investor getting 9 investments in a row, right? So I could just as well have gone 1 and 3 and never done another one. And so this is a learnable area. But I'll go to the first one in 2016. First one in Colorado. California was 2006 with the redistricting commission we got passed there. But in 2016 in Colorado, we wanted to pass open primaries. The polling numbers weren't great. And so we did 2 things. Number one, we ran a separate initiative that would require the parties to have presidential primaries, that they couldn't instead turn to a caucus or an assembly, but they instead had to let their people vote in a presidential primary. That polled at about 78%. And so even though I wasn't all that intense about that particular policy, by introducing it first and then introducing our open primaries initiative 30 seconds later, and so they were numbered sequentially, we then packaged the 2 of them together for the entire campaign. And so we had voters who, by the time they got to 108, were feeling so good about 107 that there was a halo effect. And we only won 53-47 in the end, as John remembers. And the second decision that we had to make, again, before we ever did a commercial, before we ever spent any money on the campaign itself versus all the prep, I decided that instead of going for fully open primaries, which is what my head and heart wanted to do, where a person could vote for a Republican governor and a Democratic senator, whatever, the go with semi-open primaries. So independents would be able to choose either a Democratic or a Republican ballot for the primary, but they couldn't do any kind of split voting. And so that was a compromise to make. I didn't like making it, but I was worried that we would lose otherwise. And so by, first of all, creating that other initiative that was wildly popular and drafting behind it, and second, by making a key architectural concession that broke my heart, we won 53-47. Clearly, we would have lost otherwise. And then we were able to take the momentum from that victory, and as John said, move right in 2018 onto passing federal and state level gerrymandering reform.
You know, let me dive into this, Kent, because I have fights with people all the time who say, well, just letting independents vote in the party primaries, that's not a game changer. That's not a big enough change. We have to think about, totally dismantling the primary system. How would you respond to that? I have what my response is, but tell me yours. How do you push up against that?
Yeah, and again, the statement they make is that it isn't that big a deal to let independents vote in open primaries.
Yeah.
I mean, other than questioning their sanity and respect for data, which is not actually constructive, so that's not good advice.
Right.
I couldn't disagree more. Let me give an example in Colorado that we have more independents now than either D's or R's. And since we passed the initiative in 2000, we passed in 2016, as John said, in 2018, 67% of independent voters chose a Democratic ballot. In this particular case, it was a clear repudiation of Donald Trump, and also a reflection of the broader movement of its time. Go fast forward 2 more years, where there's even more independents. 60% picked a Republican ballot in the primaries. So
Really?
it's exactly what we've always asserted what would happen. There's a fluidity that a huge chunk of America, even if they have a historical pattern of voting Republican or a historical pattern of voting Democratic, they are still, if the situation warrants, willing to move. The fact that they voted one way or another the last 3 races does not necessarily dictate what they're doing now, because the whole reason they left their party is because they were unhappy with it. And they still want to participate, they still want to vote, but they left for a reason, and it wasn't a casual reason. And so the Colorado numbers dramatically reflect the fact that there are a bunch of voters who are fluid. And even though they may have a pattern of leaning one way or another, at this time, they are revisiting all of their assumptions about who to vote and how they think about parties in America. And so even if the other side was right historically, which I assert they got it totally wrong, it is different now. There is an uncertainty, there is a fear, and a lot of historical conventional wisdom no longer applies. But you don't know that until you confront it and you fight it.
Wow.
I know. Let me make one other
Yeah.
point too. I'm sorry, John, that people look at these numbers in aggregate and they say, in general, independents, they vote consistently R, consistently D. These people, every point I made about fluidity is particularly true in swing districts and swing states.
Yeah.
And so you look at these national averages that can be misleading, because the fact that a bunch of R's are going to vote R no matter what in Alabama, or D no matter what in New York, there's all sorts of districts and states where, in fact, there isn't that kind of static arthritis. And so looking at national averages and surveys is not relevant, because the fact is there's even more voter fluidity in swing states and swing districts than in the country on average.
That's so fascinating. And I know, I was talking with Tom Riley and Jackie Salet at Arizona State University. They've set up a new think tank there, the Center for Independent and Sustainable Democracy, and they're actually doing some historical analysis of independents swinging and going in this way to push back against the narrative that there's only a tiny sliver of true independence in the country, that it's actually much more dynamic, particularly in these fluid swing situations. So it's great to hear that that's your experience in Colorado.
And you kind of do the math. You take the number, the percent of independents in your state. So let's just say it's 36% are independent. In many states now, it's much higher. Let me take 40 for an earlier number. And yeah, maybe a third of them virtually always vote in one party or the other. But the fact that the other 2/3 are fluid, that is enough to swing an election. And so sometimes people, our opponents, make a true statement. They say, hey, many independents are always going to vote D or R. You say, okay, I'll concede that to a certain extent. But the remainder is big enough to make a difference, because in state after state, it doesn't matter that you have to get 90% of the opposition. You just have to get 50% of it. And that's when you change the psychology of who runs and how they run. And
Right.
It becomes a self-reinforcing vehicle. And so some people, they're more likely to keep voting D or R because there are now better candidates in their party, because better candidates are willing to run because the primaries are open. And so once again, our opponents look at certain statistics and draw empirically and practically incorrect conclusions.
I just heard an interview with Yemi, the new mayor of Colorado Springs, who's an independent and was always an independent. And I don't want to make a connection where there isn't one, but I just wonder if giving independents the right to vote also inspires independents to take next steps and run for office and do other things politically. Be interesting to kind of look at some of those connections as well.
I think we all know people who have contemplated running for office and decided not to because of what the closed primary process is like. And so we all know, just again from our practical experience with other human beings, it makes a difference in who runs. But it also makes a difference because of the math, that any rational person has to start paying attention when you have independents growing like they are across America.
What do you, I have a couple more questions for you, Kent, then I want to open it up for the audience. And just a reminder, if you want to ask Kent a question, just type your name and one sentence description in the chat, and then I'll call on you to ask the question. Kent, what do you think is driving this surge of independence? I mean, it's in every state. It's across demographics and racial lines. It crosses ideological lines. It's just more and more Americans are saying, "I want to be independent." What's driving it?
I would cite three things. One is, I think society has changed, and if you read, back 15 years ago, Bowling Alone. So society's changed, and there tend to be less strong associations with organizations. So I think that's one reason. And actually, so I don't ramble, John, could you just repeat the question quickly?
Yeah, just what's driving more and more Americans to leave the parties or when they turn 18, just be an independent.
Yeah, and number two, of course, what we all know is there's anger and frustration and fear out there, and that's driving a significant part of it. But the third part is a reason to be optimistic. That we all know that whatever the average independent numbers are, it's much higher among our youth. In Colorado, it's about 70% of all people under 34 end up registering independent. And so it's a tidal wave, it's a tsunami, it's a tectonic plate shift. It's not a passing fad or a short-term demographic play. And the positive thing is that people are truly declaring their independence. They want to look at things through a new lens. They believe that a new lens is required, and the parties are underperforming. I often get grabbed, and someone will say, KT, you're trying to destroy the parties. I say, heck no, I'm trying to save them. That you've got your customers leaving in droves, and you're building on higher fences around smaller and smaller cities. You are on the road to oblivion, and you might take our country with it. And so the other thing driving it is the fact that parties are underperforming. And in order to get those people back, if they want them back, they just have to improve their performance and have more constructive candidates who reach out to more people. And so I think many of the partisans have these things exactly wrong. I'm neither for or against the parties. In general, I'm afraid of the notion of our society fragmented and us going through a transition and having 3, 4, 5, 6 parties. I don't argue for that, but it will happen if the existing parties do not improve their performance. And that's what we're giving them a chance to do. When we let independents vote, we are giving each party the opportunity to make themselves better. We're giving them a gift. Otherwise, they are going to go away. I mean, the Federalists, the Whigs. I mean, parties are permanent until they're not.
Right.
And the data is clear.
Right. Ken, you are a co-chair of Unite America. They're one of the leading kind of catalytic venture funds working to build out the democracy movement around the country. What's your vision as a leader at Unite for the role that they're playing in the democracy movement around the country?
Yeah, I'd say three roles. One is we want to be the equivalent of a Bain Capital or a Sequoia venture capital firm or a TPG or a KKR, where what you have is people who want to invest their money but don't have time to do the due diligence required to pick companies. They give their money to a fund. And many of you are probably invested in funds. And they do that because then it's the goal, it's the work, it's the job of that capital aggregator to go out and do due diligence, in this case, on which local groups are making a difference, which strategies can suffice. And so number one is we want to create essentially one of the preeminent capital aggregators because there's an awful lot of money sitting on the sidelines because people are scared about democracy, but they talk to 3 or 4 activist groups and they have no idea which ones just have pretty PowerPoint and are aspirational and articulate versus which ones get stuff done.
Right.
So we want to be the vehicle for all that money on the sidelines to come in and know it's going to be well allocated. Second is we're trying to create a more collaborative network. So I'll give an example. In Ohio, there's an attack on ballot initiatives themselves, where
Right.
one of the parties, it got nervous about some other stuff that might pass, and they called a special election to move up the ballot initiative level from 50 to 60. So I was able to spend time there and be quite persuaded by the quality and quantity of the work being done. And within 48 hours, make 4 phone calls, and we delivered across our network over $1 million in support. That wouldn't have happened 18 months ago because everybody was making individual decisions on their own, forcing those local people to get on 5 phone calls and pursue 5 different funders. And so, second thing we're trying to do is try to create a more collaborative and tightly coordinated network of activist groups, and so that we can better allocate resources and help each other working in concert as opposed to working in silos. And I'll just stop there, probably too soon.
No, I just to add my own 2 cents, that the more you can play a role of kind of, it's not streamlining, it's enhancing, because there are so many of these different efforts going on, offense and defense. I mean, we've had to defend. They're trying to close the primaries in like a dozen states, and that's like one of these funny issues that slips through the cracks. But the more we can pool resources and team up as different organizations and movements, it's going to benefit everybody. So I'm really glad to hear you're playing that role.
And let me give people a sense of the math, because John and I have worked together for a long time. There's over 250 do-gooder democracy groups in America now, probably over 300 at this point. We stopped counting. Over half of them have been created in the last 5 years, a reflection of what's going on with the stresses and strains in our democracy. 85% of them are operating with operating budgets of 1.5 million or less, so they're tiny. 85% are liberal and tend to only communicate with their own tribe. And so part of our job is to figure out which 25 organizations out of those 300 are putting the most actual points on the board. And then partnering with them, funding them, helping them. That's part of what we're about and what we've done with John.
All right, one last question, Kent. And this is kind of a philosophical curveball I'm going to throw at you here. In getting ready for this discussion, I watched a number of YouTube videos of you talking at business conferences. And something that came across in every one of them, regardless of the topic, is that you care a great deal about culture, about teamwork, and the kind of the environment in which people are working. And I wanted you to think, how is the democracy movement doing on the question of culture? We talk endlessly about policy, about what form of open primaries, of ranked choice. Like, we're very good at that. How are we in terms of these broader questions of democratic culture, of belonging? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's such a powerful question. I've never been asked that, so I'll be even more inept in responding, but let's play with it for a second. I think we tend to be, as you indicated, sort of policy centric, policy anal, and we describe why a policy is good, like open primaries, and we expect the world to roll over in amazement at our insight and suddenly change the way they vote. And instead, we have to listen. We have to listen to people's hopes and fears. And we have to remind them that democracy is not a spectator sport. That and the fact all of us who are in our 50s or 60s, we've had a good run the last 40 years. This is one of the best 40-year streaks for a demographic cohort to enjoy in terms of relative peace, relative economic prosperity, et cetera, et cetera. And so if any cohort, if any generation should feel a sense of obligation to protect what they inherited, and try to move it forward, and to remember that democracy didn't come easily. It wasn't sustained easily. It was never intended. It was never marketed to be easy. It's never easy to confront people who have power and therefore use that power to keep that power. And so when you start these things, you feel like Don Quixote, that it can't possibly work because the problem gets in the way of solving the problem. The problem is the wrong people. The far left and far right are just disproportionately represented. And the beautiful thing in here is that the American people are not nearly as polarized as American legislatures.
Yeah.
And so if we just get back to addressing the root cause of how the far left and the far right, who deserve their voice, they deserve their sliver, they deserve their proportional representation, they don't deserve disproportional representation. And if we listen well enough and remind people of the kind of community action that's required to sustain democracy, then we give the middle voice and choice back, and they will take care of everything else.
That's great. I think that this idea of listening to people really resonates with me. I don't think we do it enough.
Well, John, if I can sneak in there a second, when you do focus groups, as I've done now in several different states, it's inspiring. You get 14 Americans sitting on the table, and they're different races and different ages and different ethnicities and different everything, different political beliefs. When you start talking about democracy, 10 out of 12, 13 out of 14 take that conversation incredibly seriously.
Yes, they do.
And feel a sense of ownership and respect, and also in many cases fear. And we need to tap into that. You know, John Gardner used to say, liberty and duty, freedom and responsibility, that's the deal. Yep. We need to get back to having people stare at those four quadrants and reinstitute a sense of shared community challenge with respect to self-governance.
Well, this is a great segue because our first question comes from David Thornburg in Pennsylvania. And we actually just did some focus groups together in Pennsylvania about 6 months ago that were inspirational. So David, go ahead and ask your question.
Terrific, John. And Kent, as I said in the chat, thanks. Your leadership in this movement is so timely and so invaluable. I'm going to get granular, maybe something you and I talked when you were in Pennsylvania, but noting that when you run a legislative campaign, you're in the business of convincing legislators who won by one set of rules that they ought to entertain a change to those rules. And given that they veer between cautious and incredibly paranoid about their job security, just interested in your thoughts on what's proved to be effective in changing hearts and minds in that kind of situation.
Yeah, well, David, it's good to see you. And David's doing an incredible job in Pennsylvania in working on open primaries in one of the most consequential states in America. It's just beautiful. And I think there's strong elements of carrot and stick on this. And we are ramping up our effort in the states that just have legislative mechanisms. There's no citizen ballot initiative. So as a product line, we're ramping it up. And so part of it is carrot. You can't go to these elected officials and say, you know, I want you to do this just out of the goodness of your heart, and you're caring about America. That will move a certain percent, but not enough to win. And that doesn't mean the rest are evil people. You know, if you went to a CEO and said, you know, I want you to take a huge risk for the good of the world, quadruple all your environmental policies, but unfortunately that will destroy your profitability and you might lose your job. That CEO would not be immoral to say, you know, you're asking me to do too much. And so I don't characterize the people who are not willing to do it out of idealism and dedication to democracy, et cetera. I don't demonize the others because I understand that they want to keep their jobs, just like a lot of us would like to keep our jobs. And someone might ask us to do too much out of the goodness of our heart. But having said that, going to them and being sensitive to, I think you can be reelected. And even better if you can say, and by the way, we're going to raise money to help you be reelected. And we're going to make sure that people know how you stood up for democracy, et cetera, et cetera. Separate from the carrot side, which is that listening, being sensitive to their desire of being reelected, commit to helping them get reelected, is the stick. And our movement in general plays touch football, whereas the pros play tackle football. And so we write our op-eds, we reread the Gettysburg Address, makes me cry every time, but that's not going to carry the day. What's going to carry the day also is targeting a couple people who are against it, and taking them out, becoming political allies. I'll give you an example. Back when women were fighting for a vote in America, it would have taken another 10 or 20 years had prohibitionists not decided that they were never going to win prohibition with only men voting, because more women were in favor of prohibition. So they became the political strange bedfellows that helped get women's suffrage over the mark far sooner than it would have otherwise. And they were right. They then passed prohibition. As we all know, society rejected it within a few years. But the point is, our movement tends to work as a little silo. And instead, it needs to go to the unions. It needs to go to the Chamber of Commerce. It needs to go to the Black ministers and start to have them understand why their best interests are served, not in some theoretical way, but a very practical way. So carrot, as I indicated, with listening and support, real support, stick in terms of going after some of the opponents, and then also this reaching out to build coalitions, not thinking that we're going to go off by ourselves as a small cavalry coming over the hill and repel the invaders.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
That's very well put. We have a question from Tracy Moore in Georgia about engaging business leaders in the business community. Go ahead, Tracy.
Yes. Hi, Kent. Thank you for being here. I am with Georgians United, a very small nonprofit focused on introducing Final Five voting in Georgia. And my question for you is advice on how best to engage the business community with the assumption that these are key influencers of our legislators.
Yeah. Oh, I'm working hard on this. I mean, given I was a Fortune 500 CEO for 28 years, it's tough. Yeah. First of all, we have to just confront that what's going on with Disney in Florida, what went on with Delta and Coke in Georgia, freezes the CEOs. And so even many of them and their executive teams and people that would like to be involved, they're so afraid of getting caught in the crossfire of today's societal battles. And so first, job one is that we be empathetic towards why they're concerned. Number two is what we need to do, and what I'm in the process of doing in many cases, is giving them an a la carte menu as to how they can get involved without taking significant risk. I'll just give one example. Helping your people become poll workers, helping local counties work on their cybersecurity, have them work on their operating procedures, have them work on their leadership development. These are things that would really help our American democracy and our election system, both substantively and perceptually. And there's virtually no risk and they're going to be taken to task for that in a way that hurts them. The third thing we need to do is start to gain momentum collectively. There's strength in numbers. And so I spoke 3 months ago to the Business Council. It's a group of 250 of the largest company CEOs in the country. And I got to put together a panel, and I chose Mitt Romney from the R's and Michael Bennet from Colorado as the D. And it took a year to get people to agree to do this, but we got to talk to them about this issue of getting engaged in a way that's prudent, that's not foolish. Disney and Coke and Delta all made mistakes that created their problem. And we need to help others learn from those mistakes in order for them to get comfortable. But baby steps is important, and trying to move them in groups. So for example, in gerrymandering in Colorado, I put together a tripartisan coalition with big companies involved on both sides that really helped, enhanced our convening ability. It really helped our credibility to say that we were speaking for independence in the community. And we did it in a way that was safe for them.
Hmm. Thank you. We have a number of questions, Kent, from people in Colorado. John Lemke has a question about moving from open primaries to proportional representation. There's a question from Curtis Hansen about further electoral and legislative reforms in Colorado. And then Wes Sawyer wants to know what's the best way to combat the current efforts in the state legislature to close the primaries. So I don't want to like have Colorado monopolize this conversation, but maybe you could talk about what's next in Colorado and what to do about these efforts to close the primaries in Colorado.
Yeah, well, first, hello to fellow Coloradans, and it's great that you're on so we can continue to work on our Colorado democracy. So I'm just thrilled to have you here, and our work isn't done yet. We did pass open primaries in 2016. We did pass 2 gerrymandering in 2018. They have made a big difference in preserving the health of our democracy already. But going forward, well, we want to move to nonpartisan primaries where there's one ballot and everybody votes using that ballot. Personally, I'm a big advocate of the top 4 move to the general election with ranked choice voting. And so that may or may not be the right policy for Colorado, but in general, it is the gold standard in my mind. And we need to get rid of caucuses. The caucuses are a cancer on the body politic, where a small, and this is still the case in so many states, including states with open primaries like Colorado, where a small group of people arrange these caucuses in highly selective manner, not with high transparency. It's impossible for many people to participate, and yet that determines a person who gets a lot of earned media and gets on the ballot. And so we need to eliminate caucuses, and we need to move towards nonpartisan primaries. And that answer is the same for so many states, but that's what we're contemplating here in Colorado, even as we speak.
Great. Thanks, Kent. We have a question from Jim Resser about whether an open primary helps or hurts third parties. Go ahead, Jim. Jim, you still there? You got to take yourself off mute.
Okay, I'm here. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just thinking the Forward Party has been moving towards trying to change the state and local makeup. You know, with how do I want to say it? They're trying to build their party from the ground up, rather than we're like no labels, let's try to do from the top down. Does that help or hurt those organizations?
Yeah, I think open primaries help democracy, period. And given we're at a stage where a high percentage of Americans, including those who are still in the parties, are not happy, the more we can do to create choice and voice and fluidity, the better. And again, I say that not with an intent of eliminating either of the parties. It's to give them a chance to survive. And so I think in general, open primaries does make things better for someone who wants to do something new and different. And that is in fact a gift to help the parties save themselves from themselves. But I think they unambiguously increase the fluidity of the system, and fluidity in a democracy is good. Arthritis is bad.
As someone with bad arthritis in my knees, I know it's bad. We're going to go to Sarah Smallhouse in Arizona, who has a question about the rules in Colorado. Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, Kent. It's nice to see you. Thank you for doing this.
Hi, Sarah. Good to see you.
We are organizing an open nonpartisan primary in Arizona for the November 24 ballot. And we're trying different arguments. One of the things you haven't mentioned that I was wondering if it's the same in Colorado, but in Arizona, independent candidates are also at a big disadvantage. They have to collect over 6 times as many signatures to make the ballot. And as a result, and then that is one of several disadvantages they have, but a big one. We don't have any independent representatives, and independents are our biggest group of registered voters in Arizona now. So is that the same in Colorado? And was that a helpful argument in presenting the advantages of open primaries?
Without getting into too much detail, the short answer is no. Colorado didn't have that kind of stuff like the 6 times difference. But there are many states that do. And what we found, and we have to play the long game. So I started with open primaries on purpose because I felt it was the most winnable, and then we could use that momentum to do gerrymandering, and we could use that momentum to move on to what we're going to go next. And in some cases, Sarah, I would recommend that you do something that just fixes those problems. You know, in the focus groups, time and time again, the word fairness is emphasized. Yep. That if you go out and talk to thousands of voters and say, if we make this change and have open primaries, everything will be better. Well, that's not credible. In fact, the open primaries do have a bigger impact than people realize, but you can't win that argument in many cases because people are too jaundiced from everything they've experienced the last 10, 20 years. But when you talk to them about fairness and you say the independent candidate has to have 6 times as many signatures, they get ticked off. They go, you know what? I don't believe that if we pass up on primaries, suddenly, you know, everybody's going to have a nicer car and there'll be peace in the world and free groceries. Yeah, I don't, but I do believe we should be fair. And so sometimes you have to take half a loaf in order to generate momentum to continue and really think about emphasizing fairness as opposed to thinking that we're going to persuade everyone that these things are as powerful as in fact they are. But we also know, you know, there's states with open primaries that are not well governed. So there is no single silver bullet. It's instead sort of a rich stew of things that need to be stirred. And along the way, Sarah, I think you've got great examples of unfairness.
We're focusing on that, Kent. We're on that page and marching down that street, believe me.
Amen. And then hopefully, but the movement, and we need to get out and, you know, if you're in the Ukraine, if we just gave them bullets, they would lose. So we have to give them missiles and tanks. Otherwise, there's no chance. Similarly, in our movement, we need money and we need endorsements. I mean, Denise and I, my wife, we've put over $15 million into this movement over the last 6 years, and we plan on continuing to do that. And so just like a shopping mall needs an anchor tenant, what local movements need to do is make sure they're bold in going and seeking anchor tenants for their democracy mall, because winning on merit alone is not a sound strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Well, good luck, Sarah.
Well, you're going to hear from us more.
We have a question, Kent, from Sandra Fish, who is with the Colorado Sun. A question about the national picture and efforts to close the primaries in Colorado. Go ahead, Sandra.
Thanks. I'm wondering what Unite America's plans are for 2024, and if you can be any more specific about the Colorado plans. Are there specific states that Unite America is targeting for 2024? You talked a little bit about Colorado, and sounds like you're interested in an Alaska type system.
Yeah, so in Colorado, I mentioned the kind of things that we're contemplating, and we'll look forward to your input. And then elsewhere, what Unite America, and I talked about our need to identify sort of the top 20 organizations or so across the country there's already about 7 or 8 organizations / individuals. When I say individuals, they're typically people of great wealth who have their own staff working on this. And so we are continuing to advance down that path of collaboration and coordination, because, for example, this year, for the first time, we divided up. There are about 14 states of interest across the product lines of gerrymandering, open primaries, and nonpartisan primaries. And we divided them up. And so different groups are focused on different states and doing all the due diligence. And then we're having regular calls to think about the arguments pro and con on different states. And then when we see something exciting, like Pennsylvania, like Ohio, we can pounce on it in a collective way and have far more impact. So this movement building, this network building is very much a work in process. It's part of what I'm spending a lot of time on, that these groups can stay independent and they can have their own strategy, but we need to coordinate both for donors and for the local groups actually being effective. And so over the next few months, we will be choosing which states and which policies this collective network will be going after. And then we'll hopefully cooperate in the ones that we choose.
Sandra, maybe I
Oh,
could
you
just...
know, John, let me say one thing
Yeah.
quick. One new thing, separate from gerrymandering, open primaries and nonpartisan primaries, some with ranked choice voting, some without. We are now thinking as a fourth product line, just as important, is protecting ballot initiatives because of the attacks happening around the country. And then the fifth and final product in our suite of products is one of increasing importance, which is the legislative strategies for the states that don't have it. And you think about it, it's sort of ironic. When we spend $21 million to win in Nevada last year, it could be that $21 million might be enough to persuade 3 state legislatures to do something. And so it's kind of resource allocation again becomes a fascinating issue. Are we spending too much of our movement's capital on some of these high profile, highly expensive, highly binary initiatives versus that same amount of capital or a portion thereof being allocated to working within legislatures where a fraction of that amount of money can make you a serious player? So these are some of the conversations that we're having now. And that's a good thing that they're taking place because they weren't 3 years ago. They're not yet where we all need them to be and want them to be, but it's like democracy, a work in process.
Just to add my 2 cents here, one of the things I'm most excited about is that national organizations like Unite, like the Institute for Political Innovation, like Article 4, are growing and engaging and building the kind of tactical strategic capacity that you're talking about, Ken. And that's very important and very needed. Simultaneously, the caliber of local leadership is really growing. I mean, my colleague Jeremy Gruber just got back from Oklahoma City 2 days ago. Our local activists in Oklahoma City put together 100 civic and business leaders with the mayor of Tulsa and the state labor commissioner, and got half a dozen media outlets to cover it for a dialogue about moving Oklahoma to an open primary system. That's a meeting that 5 years ago would be inconceivable at that level. So there's this really exciting national strategic development up from the bottom leadership development, and those two coming together, I think, is the formula for success all over the country.
Yeah, I think those words are very well chosen, John. And for example, Represent Us, one of those groups in our collective network, that's an independent group led by wonderful people, and they've got some neat training courses for people who are going to start working locally on some of this stuff. I was one of their faculty members recently. So that's an example. We don't want 5 different do-gooder groups to create training programs. What we want to do is find someone like Represent Us who takes it seriously, and then helping them get better and helping network people so that there's good, robust participation, as just one example.
Yep, that's what we need to be doing. All right, we have just time for one or two more questions. I'm going to go to Benjamin Valamont in Pennsylvania, who has a question about some of the opposition's arguments against open primaries. Go ahead, Benjamin.
In Pennsylvania, recently we had a hearing on open primaries. And one of the things that kept coming up was the detractors of it kept using the fact that we have the major parties have their internal political party elections happening in primaries. And they used it as an excuse to not pass semi-open primaries. I was wondering, what have other states done to get past this issue?
Benjamin, I had a little bit of technical issues for 10 seconds there. Could you please repeat it? Because I'm afraid I won't get it right otherwise.
Okay, in Pennsylvania, the detractors of open primaries here use the fact that in our primaries, they also use them to elect their internal party leaders. So they use it to say,
Yeah.
we can't pass open primaries because of that.
Yeah, and that's yes, that does come up in other places, and the fact is, it's just not logical. They can still do everything they do now for those elections. Now, one of the things that they get scared of with open primaries is if there's two separate things, they won't get the turnout that they would like. Although in many instances they are engineering things for a small turnout so they can control the outcome. So I think the answer is to systematically point out how easy it is for them to preserve that parallel process, which is different, but still takes advantage of the same infrastructure as the new process. So it's easy to kind of say it from the 10,000-foot level, but when you actually walk through the administrative responsibilities of having those internal leader elections and having the public open primary, that in fact, 98% of the systems and procedures can stay exactly the same.
One last question from Curtis Hanson in Colorado. How to get connected. Go ahead, Curtis.
Oh, hi. I was just asking how those of us in Colorado can connect to Kent to support your work.
I actually don't have a United. I operated independently for several years, and I just joined United America, so I still just use my own email, which is kt@kentthiry.com. So feel free. I will not be quickly responsive. Please understand, I cannot keep up with incoming, but I'll forward it to the team. And we are exploring. This is just a new thing because the Republican Party in Colorado may, when we passed the initiative, in order to reduce constitutional risk, you have to leave the parties certain power. And so we said, and there's no case law here. And so we said, if you get 75% of your central committee, you can, to vote for opting out of the primary, you can. So we did that, and we did not get a constitutional challenge. So that was good. But right now, the Republican Party in Colorado is so captured by the far right that they may actually opt out, which will be political suicide for them in virtually all general elections, but they may do it. And so what that creates for us in Colorado is in fact an opportunity, because there's going to be a huge additional chunk of moderate voters available for kinship. And so we may begin to create something to help independents stay independent. I do not want to create another party, but nonetheless, to create certain sharing of information, sharing of perspectives, to enable them to step into the void that will be created by a Democratic Party that's moving further to the left and a Republican Party that may be committing suicide.
Ken, this hour has gone by very quickly. I just wanted to, before we close, give you an opportunity to share some last thoughts or anything we didn't cover that you'd like to share with people.
Well, first, again, just thank you for caring enough to be on this call, and thank you for the work that so many of you have done. I believe why I never thought I would be doing this at this stage of my life. I'm on the board of the Nature Conservancy and was gonna focus on the environment, but realized we can't deal with climate change until we get back and transform a low-performing American democracy back into a solidly performing American democracy. I believe this is the existential issue of our time. If we do not get it right, we cannot get much else right. We can't get climate change right. We can't get immigration right. It now affects our geopolitical security, as so many of our allies have to hedge their bets with China because we've become so unreliable. And so at this point, it is, in my mind, the existential issue of our time. And I repeat, democracy is something special. History indicates that it's difficult to keep it going. So nobody ever said it would be easy, but it's very clear. If you look at the 1890s, the 1900s, the 1960s and 70s, when the people get ticked off enough, those people that have the power and want to use the power to keep the power, we can take them down through concerted action, through acts of sacrifice, acts of bravery, the likes of which have happened many times over our country's history. And what I hate about this is that my language is not hyperbolic. It's real.
Yeah.
Our democracy is at risk, and both domestically and nationally. And so I just want to say thank you, and please keep doing what you're doing. It's worth it.
Yeah, you too, Ken. Thank you for, your consistent, ongoing, persistent leadership. It makes a huge difference. And I'm convinced the best is yet to come. So thanks for taking the time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We've got a number of very interesting and exciting virtual discussions coming up in the fall. So stay tuned and have a great day. Take care.